really, hinders development and really lead to diseconomies of scale. So trade offers really a solution to this issue and huge potential opportunities to move up the value chain in manufacturing, to increase productivity, and to enhance the living standards of the population, have knowledge transfer, and it has also the potential to increase revenues and reduce poverty. So I see trade as the driver for change in the continent. I think one of the key issues, challenges that we have is about how we are using trade. And here let me mention two elements. One is out of the total trade for Africa, manufactured goods represent less than a quarter of the total exports. More than half of the exports are raw materials, whether in form of fuel or metals and minerals. So what we are exporting, as raw material without really adding much value. So it's almost, we're losing opportunities for development by really just parting with these raw materials and then exporting, in almost all cases, these materials after they have been processed and have higher value added and paying even more. Even worse, we have African countries that, for example, produce oil, sell it as raw material, as crude oil, and then export refined oil. And some of the largest producers in the country, I think we know who I'm talking about. So that in itself tells you that even when you have a commodity price boom and higher oil prices, you're missing on the opportunity because you still have to part with your crude oil at lower price and buy it back refined at much higher prices. So on net, you may not even be getting any of the windfall. So these are some of the things that really very important in terms of the trade and the composition. But then also another very important issue is the intra-African trade. And we have the intra-African trade stands at 14% of total trade. And if you compare it to Asia, they have more than 50%. Europe close to 70%. So basically we have huge lost opportunities for trading among ourselves. The good news here is that we've been making progress on the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. And it comes at a historic and opportune time. So, we have 54 countries that have signed the agreements. We have 46 countries that have already been signatories and started to adopt these protocols. And really these countries represent a huge weight in terms of out of the continents. You have 94% of the population and GDP, and a substantial amount of the total trade. So this can be really the vehicle through which we can think it can play a huge a role in terms of transforming the continent going forward, because the idea is that we will be able, through that trade agreement, to really work on building up the value chain, building regional value chains, and it comes at a time where there has been disruptions in global supply chains and a huge shift from focus on cost and efficiency to actually focus more on trust and proximity. And that's really the entry point for Africa, because now we can get into value chains that we would not have been able to do before. But because of the geopolitical situation, we can build into links with Europe and with other regions where these value chains had been closed before to us. And we can build more among ourselves to really build these value chains and build opportunities. A very interesting example of work that ECA did was in DRC, looking into the issue of battery production in DRC. And the study shows that actually producing batteries in DRC would be 30% cheaper than doing it in the US or in China, and with lower net emissions. So these are the type of opportunities that we would be losing by exporting raw materials, and DRC is rich of the raw materials required to produce the batteries, if we actually don't invest in building around these value chains domestically and regionally. So this is how I really see, the opportunity being offered by trade, and particularly intra-African trade, and using the African trade agreement.
Thank you very much for that, Hanan. I think you've set us off on a very good note, mentioning, of course, that trade is a vector for, as you said, for production at along value chains, for increased productivity, for knowledge transfer, of course, revenue generation, poverty reduction, and driver of growth. I want to just pack all of this. We'll come back to them and interrogate a bit more, especially as regards the second half of the question of conversation. That is how could young people get involved. But you also mentioned a number of other important things. That you said that African trade is underperforming, especially just given the concentration of commodities, raw materials in the exports. The manufactured sector only accounts for about 25% of external trade. You gave a very striking example of crude oil in some cases being exported, but refined oil being imported. You pointed to the AFCFTA as as a promising vehicle for changing intra-African trade, and then you ended up with two things which I think are important. Again, I'd like to pack them and come back to them. One is the way that the geopolitical situation is changing, and so this concept of friendshoring, nearshoring, as you said, the opportunities that they would open up for African countries to be involved in these value chains. And then also in the example on the DRC, you're sort of raising the issue of how trade can contribute to the climate issue through the battery production and so on. So I think all of this is very, very important. Let's pack them and let's hear from Maudo, representing one of the young Africans who can benefit from trade. So Maudo, what is your take on the question? How is trade driving economic transformation?
Sure, thank you. And I wanted to point out two things really quickly. One is my journey in understanding what we're talking about today actually started in not this very room, but the one opposite, where I was listening to Thandika Kandawire, who is this very distinguished professor, sort of teach me a lot of what I'm going to say today. So I just wanted to mention that he has now passed away, so may he rest in peace. But I really want to say that because I think that's incredibly important. Secondly, is that the two people sitting next to me are people who I have looked up to for a very long time and read things that they've said and things that they've been able to do and sort of tried to learn from that. So again, I want to preface my comments by saying that it's I run the risk of trying to. I'm definitely not going to try and argue with anything that's being said because the experience level is different. But I think what I want to add things that I have experienced and also just I'm hoping a slightly different perspective, which is one from sort of the consulting and advisory side of things, where sort of working with governments and trying to get them to achieve the things that they've put in their vision and plan, and how difficult that can be sometimes with competing interests, vested interests, and a perpetually changing sort of geopolitical climate, right? So I think the first thing I wanted to highlight in this case is that I found it useful to always look at the world in terms of incentives, right? constantly asking myself, what is a person, a government, an institution's incentive to do X, Y, or Z? Which is a very helpful way of going beyond sort of the nice to haves or this would be great and going to the necessities, right? Because I think, particularly where we are as a continent, we're still at a point where even the goods that sell very well are necessities, right? Sugar, rice, and so on. You don't find many African economies where luxury goods are particularly widely consumed, right? If you opened a Gucci store in certain parts of Africa, I don't think you'd have much success. So the point of that is to say that a lot of the time, what we're really talking about and what really will drive the AFCFTA are sort of primary goods at the very start, so sort of the short term, and then the aspiration is that at some point, as Dr. Morsy mentioned, we will have manufactured value-added goods that we can also trade with one another, right? So it's important to understand that this project is not a 2-year project. It's not an election cycle project. It's a 50-year project that will then transform not only the way we trade, but how the goods that we trade with one another, because there are new opportunities that will be possible that weren't possible before. And I'll give you an example. So when I was working in Ghana, I was embedded in the Ministry of Trade in Ghana, and one of the key priorities for the president, but also the minister at the time, was to introduce vehicle manufacturing, or assembly to be more specific, right? And they've had some very good successes. If you have time and you're interested in that, please look at that. Ghana has managed to attract OEMs, manufacturers like Toyota, Nissan, Volkswagen to assemble cars in Ghana, which is a first in West Africa. Not to ignite the old rivalry between Ghana and Nigeria, but this was tried in Nigeria and it didn't work very well for various reasons, and then it sort of ended up working in Ghana. Again, you can in your own time find out why that was. But one of the things I'm most proud of, I think, in my very short career is having been a part of that and having that success. And one of the main reasons that was possible even was because for these OEMs, Ghana as a country of 30 million people with a sort of GDP per capita that it has would not have been that attractive. However, Ghana, a country within the AFCFTA, who also has access to countries around it, is a very attractive proposition for investors. So that tends to be the difference most of the time between pre-AFCFTA and post-AFCFTA countries and how these countries can approach investors. Because most of the time investors are looking for volume, so the number of people in your population, or they're looking for high GDP per capita, so high spending power, right? Because that's how they're gonna make money. Unfortunately, for most of our countries, even when we have high GDP per capitas, I would say it's false because it's not representative of the spending power of individuals in that country. So really what you're looking for is a high population and a high number of people that consume your goods. And the AFCFTA gives you that. So that's a very practical example that I wanted to share. The second is, also we looked into, and when I say we, this is when I was with the Tony Blair Institute and working in sort of the West Africa region. We looked at creating the possibility of having a textile and garment manufacturing base in West Africa that would look at connecting Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, and Ghana, and having that be a base not only for production for the sub-region of West Africa, but the continent as a whole. And again, you're seeing a trend here where investors are a lot more likely to engage when they see the opportunity to have a cross-national setup than just single countries. Because unfortunately, and this is one thing that I never understand when people sort of talk about further fragmenting countries, right? We're already quite weak. We already have very low economic basis. And when you talk about further fragmenting those countries, you're further weakening them and making them less attractive to investors, which would make it very difficult to develop, right? I know there are political and sort of historic reasons for that, and I don't mean to sort of disparage any of that, but I just wanted to point out that actually we're stronger together. And the bigger markets we can create, the more attractive we can be for investors, both locally and internationally. So locally, as there's a reason a lot of funding is going into Nigeria, for example, to do things, is because over 200 million people, the economics make sense, right? So let's just keep that in mind as we go on. And I wanted to park here and allow for further questions, but I think that sort of sets the scene quite well.
Thank you very much for that, Maudo. In fact, what you have done is elaborate a bit on what Hanan said about the potential of the AFCFTA in terms of providing scale economies, volume, as you said. The two examples you gave of automobile manufacturing, which has started in Ghana, as well as the textile clothing sector in Togo and Ghana, underscore precisely that in a bigger market, you're more likely to attract investment, which of course then feeds into the value chain, feeds into generating more trade. I'll just take you up on one issue, that is we are not waiting for 50 years to transform the African continent. In fact, some of the modeling suggests that by 2045, which is only 23 years away, you can have a doubling of intra-African trade, and that gave us a very, very low figure. But that's what the modeling is saying, that this low figure could double by 2045, 2 decades away. But I think also you made some very important points about how national visions need to buy into these opportunities and the incentives that are there for these bigger markets. So thank you for that. Before we bring others into the conversation, I'd just like to come to the second part of the question we are looking at, and that is how can the youth get involved. I think very clearly you both identified where the opportunities are. This conference is about the now and next generation, so I'm sure that there are many waiting to hear how to get involved in this transformation that is underway. Hanan.
So let's maybe start with what would matter for youth. And what would matter for youth is having job opportunities of better quality and higher pay. And these are the type of opportunities that will be available when you properly implement the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Because now you open a huge market, like if you think about it, the whole continental as one market. This is a huge potential that brings economies of scale, that opens opportunities that would have never been available at a national level. So with the creativity of the youth and with the opportunities for digitalization, which is one of the areas that are also included in the African Continental Trade Agreement, opens a huge opportunity. Let me also emphasize that relative to other continental free trade agreements, the African one is unique in the following. It goes beyond the trade just in goods. It covers trade in services. It covers actually competition policy. It covers investment. So it opens the market in an unprecedented way if all these issues would be covered. You can think of it. I mean, when an investor go to the European Union, what is the advantage of doing that? Is that once you go, if you invest or open a factory in France, with the same knowledge of the rules and regulations of what you need to do as an investor, you can go to another one and it would be easy for you to expand across the continent. Same thing for Africa. So the opportunity that when an investor really enters one of the markets, it opens the door for that investor to expand across the continent, whether in trade or in investment. And that in itself, opens a huge market. Let's not underestimate that the continent is young and only getting younger. It's the only continent. Unfortunately, I know there are many here that are young, but I'm not sure that you will get younger. That's the bad news. But on the positive side, the continent will continue to get younger. The median age in Africa now is 19 years old, and you have 77% of the population that is less than 35 years old. I mean, it's a humongous opportunity. And with the, really, by 2050, out of, 5 newborns, Africa will have 2. So you're really like, this is a market that cannot be, disregarded. That will only go up in importance and in size. So really focusing on that market and opportunity within it would unleash huge potential for the youth. And also the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement has protocols. Particularly, it's one of the unique elements of it. It has protocols on women and for youth. And it's one of the things that are being now, discussed and negotiated. And the issues of bringing the elements of digitalization of trade also offers huge opportunity, especially, and this will be a very important enabler going forward. Working on the cross-border payment systems will be critical. This holds the key to really make trade more inclusive, overcome issues that exist, especially for countries that have foreign exchange shortages. I know, for example, that there are cases, not sure I should name the countries, but let's say 2 African countries where they currently have the goods, but they cannot trade because of FX shortages. If you have a functioning, a cross-border payment system, you would not have that issue because you would be able to trade with the local currencies without the need to worry about FX availability. So it really removes barriers for many of the youth and the investors and opens the door to do more. So these are the type of elements that we really need to focus on. And I think we all know that innovation and energy and drive always comes from youth. And with these opportunities in the horizon and increasing use of both cross-border payment and digitalization, it really provides unparalleled windows to really reap all these benefits and do investments and build value chains, because also a lot of this current generation across time is actually increasingly having more entrepreneurship, having more companies, so that in itself also opens opportunity to be part of the value chains that we're talking about, that there need to be built regionally and domestically, and to expand into much greater markets than would have been available from before.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that. And again, just to underscore a couple of things before I bring Maudo in. Thank you for bringing in the issue of services. Very important, because we tend to think of trade as trading goods, but certainly services are also part of trade and very much a part of the AFCFTA. And talking about young people, as you said, these services sectors, just to name a few of them that are being prioritized: transport, communications, finance, business services, tourism, energy. These are all opportunities, of course, for young people to get involved. You mentioned innovation. You mentioned entrepreneurship. You mentioned the possibilities that digitalization is also opening up. And indeed, yes, you also mentioned this protocol on women and youth, which is unique to the FCFTA, looking at, again, to use Maudo's phrase, the kinds of incentives that African countries across the board can adopt to bring in and ensure inclusion of women and youth in this way. You also, I think I'd like to underscore that you mentioned that as the FCFTA evolves, you're looking at a common regulatory regime across several policy areas like competition policy, investment, as you mentioned. I could add in intellectual property rights as well as of course digitalization, as you mentioned. So I think what we see unfolding, we started off, with this issue about the underperformance of African trade, but I think what we see unfolding is a new policy framework that is emerging, that is looking at how to deal with this underperformance in a new and dynamic way. So I think you have unpacked that for us, and I'm sure that in a wider conversation, we'll come back to some of these issues. So now, Maudo, let me turn to you and ask the same question: how can the youth be involved?
Yeah, I think the two main areas. So I think the opportunities that exist, that's area one. And then the second one is just, I guess, how perceptions around young people and the interests of young people need to evolve somewhat to better include them. So the first one around opportunities, I see three broad areas that are opportunities today, not tomorrow, not as the mistake that I made about 50 years. It's much less. Opportunities that I see today. Yesterday I had the pleasure of sitting through a presentation that was given by, can I say our colleague? It is now. And it really underscored the opportunity that exists in infrastructure, right? And I think let's not broaden it too much. Let's focus on just construction within infrastructure, right? That's an opportunity for young people to really innovate around how can we build smarter, stronger, more sustainable infrastructure. And that is an opportunity that exists today on the continent, right? Second, that we need to solve is if we're going to have this sort of cross-border trade in all kinds of goods, we need to solve the logistics problem, right? Africa has a huge logistics problem. And that is an opportunity that, again, that exists today. I'll give you one quick example, which this sort of prominent, I'm from the Gambia, by the way, and there's this prominent businessman in the Gambia who tried to send a package from the Gambia to Senegal. And those of you who know sort of the map of West Africa, Gambia is inside Senegal. It's literally surrounded by Senegal. You can drive from the capital of Gambia to Dakar in 4 hours, right? This gentleman sent a package to Dakar from Banjul through DHL. It flew to Paris, right? And then flew back to Dakar. And this is a package. It could have been driven for 4 hours and it would have gotten there a lot quicker, right? So that needs to be solved, 100%. And then the third opportunity is in economic transformation itself, right? Because what we're doing now is, as Dr. Morsy mentioned, is we're exporting goods in their raw form, right? And there's a real opportunity to add value, not only for export, but for domestic consumption, because the African consumer is also a lot more sophisticated than they used to be. They want better quality goods, and they're willing to pay for it, right? So, and again, I'll give you an example. I have a friend who, studied at Yale and then decided, okay, instead of going the usual route, went back to Nigeria and set up this company called Relief, right? Relief is a tech company, but what they're focused on is digitalizing and creating a more efficient way of processing agricultural goods, right? And they've had a lot of success. They've been featured on Forbes, although being featured on Forbes is not always, a good thing, as we've seen recently. But they've been featured on CNN and BBC and so on. And really, I've been inspired by what they've done because they've managed to marry the ambitions of young people, which is to have these sort of exciting tech companies and be at the forefront of digital, transformation, but also tie it to a critically important issue, which is adding value to our primary products. And I think that is a great example of how young people can really embrace what we're talking about here today in economic transformation, but then add a sort of exciting and innovative and trendy twist to it that would make them maybe, get up and do it and be excited about it. And I've heard people talk a lot about making agriculture and industrialization more sexy, and I guess that's a way of doing that, right? So that's one aspect, which is opportunities. Now, in terms of sort of the perspective of young people and how young people these days would view themselves and what they want and so on, absolutely, and I completely agree. There's a lot of young people who are looking for better paying jobs, dignity in their workplace. They want jobs that they can have and be excited about. But increasingly, young people want jobs that give them the opportunity to have impact. And they want impact, and sometimes unrealistically, but very quickly, right? Not, I want to sit in this job and wait 20 years to have impact. No, but how can I have impact maybe in a year or 2 years? And I think that is a really important aspect that policymakers need to take into consideration. When we're creating jobs for the younger generation, we need to build in this opportunity to have impact and be at the forefront of some of the things that are being done in a way that maybe previous generations didn't really have that sort of ambition straight away, right? And I'm open to being corrected on that, but that's just the perception that I have. And then the second aspect of it is, I can speak for myself because I am an African youth. I honestly have never felt more proud of being an African youth. I mean, these days with the cultural influence that we have, we have songs from the continent charting around the world, alongside hip hop and R&B and pop and rock and so on, and that sometimes people push that to the side and say, well, that's just culture, right? But it has a very real impact. I'll give you an example. So a friend of mine worked for the diaspora office in Ghana, they had a huge influx of investment on the back of this, initiative that they had, which was around bringing African Americans back to Ghana and giving them that opportunity to even have citizenship and so on. And again, people dismissed it as some, something that the president was doing because it was, a PR campaign or whatever. But it brought back some real investment. People stayed and they invested and they started businesses and they created jobs and they created linkages that weren't there before. And also that other thing, intangible premium that you mentioned yesterday during the talk, is that people inherently have this bias against investing in Africa. Even, as you mentioned, countries with the same fundamentals economically, you would have a premium on risk, in investing in Africa just because it is Africa. And what this cultural trend has done is take away some of that negative perception and allowed people to see Africa in a new light, which I argue would then bring down that premium that we see. And I think that's a very good thing. And I think policymakers need to really encourage and push the creative side of things and be more savvy in how they push their PR for their own countries, right? And I see some investment promotion agencies are doing this more now, and that's a really good sort of development. So those are the sort of two areas, one around opportunities and another around perception that I think,
Indeed.
to point out.
No, thank you very much for that. And no one is here to correct anything. It's only to help drive the conversation along. But I think these two issues that you raise, opportunity, perception, and the way that you framed it around, the way infrastructure is opening up, including, as you said, smart infrastructure, the way that digitalization could be embedded in infrastructure. Indeed, we had a very good conversation yesterday on these issues, and a lot is going on, a lot is being invested in this area, mentioning, of course, logistics. Now, thankfully, there is the new bridge between over the Gambia, so that package that went all the way to Paris. And that is another example of how the infrastructure actually, points that was made yesterday, that the infrastructure is being put in place. We are seeing more and more and more of the infrastructure that is coming in. You built upon Hanan's point that the median age is 19. And of course, young people are very much into culture, into music, into films. We're seeing the popularity in channels like Netflix, of Nollywood, and all across the continent. Actually, we are seeing. I was just watching a film the other day from Kenya, actually, on Netflix, and that speaks to your second point, that this is helping to change the perception, because I think more and more we are seeing these barriers being broken, and of course, it's young people who are at the forefront of doing this, making these changes. To the perception, to the issues about risk investment. We had a good conversation on that yesterday, as you pointed out. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think panelists have, sort of laid out the issues. I can see so many hands, but that's exactly what the point is to have this conversation. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to be democratic. I'm going to start this side of the room, then I'll go to that side, and then I'll come to this side. So let's start with, and what we'll do is, rather than do a back and forth, we'll just have all the points that people want to make, they make their points, ask their questions, and then we'll go back to Hanan and Maudo at the end, but let everybody have a chance. So let's start over here. Thank you, Victory, for you're putting.
If you would have to project when asking your questions, we have just one mic for now.
That's okay. Thank you for your responses so far. It's been really insightful. My question is kind of more of looking at Africa from an outside perspective. So what kind of processes or kind of things do you think Africa could do to mitigate the issues, say from external frameworks such as the BRI and kind of the debt crises in terms of repayments to China and also just like external infrastructure and stuff like that? How could Africa, kind of mitigate those risks and issues that come with, the transformation of Africa?
Okay, I think that one will be mainly for Hanan. Anyone else on this side of the room? Yes, please. Yeah.
Hi, my name is William Awomoyi. My question is to do with the AFCTA. It is a legal framework and it is projected to increase intra-African trade by about 8%. However, it is a legal framework and we know that a law is only as strong as its ability to be enforced. And in the legal framework, the principal agents are states. And so my question is actually in regards to state capacity. How can we boost state capacity to ensure that states are producing around strategic value? Because currently the logistical problem that we see is that since most of the countries are producing and exporting raw materials, there's not really an incentive to trade with each other, because if let's say I have a plate of jollof rice and you have a plate of jollof rice, we can't really trade the jollof rice because it's just the same. So my question is, how can we get states to actually produce strategic value so that they'll be able to effectively trade within Africa?
Okay, thank you.
Hello, my name is Kelechi. I've also got a question around the AFCTA agreement. And I was just wondering, how does the agreement intend to address some pain points, structural, infrastructural pain points, like cross-border dispute resolution, insurance, border control issues with, logistics, generally things like that, yeah.
And that's it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Hello, thank you so much for what you've just spoken about. My name is Ruben Lindo. I was raised in London, but I'm originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo. You've mentioned that Congo is great in terms of the production of batteries, which is true. Congo is known for its resources, etc., etc. But I do believe that we really need to look at different ways in which we're able to essentially trade ethically and really look at everything down, because within these sort of production and everything else, there's children that are also involved as well, and companies really need to essentially look at different ways in which to essentially prevent that from happening. Because yes, trade, we are benefiting from resources, but I don't believe that it should be impacting children, but it's also affecting the environment as well. Because obviously when you do essentially mine, it does cause impurities, which essentially does affect communities, such as obviously the river, etc., etc. So what ways can we essentially trade ethically in that sort of instance? Thank you very much.
So I don't want the speakers to be overwhelmed. Do you want to answer some first and then we go around again, or how do you want it to? Should I just go ahead?
My thinking was to give everybody a chance to get their views in, and then they will come back to all the questions because everybody wants to talk. Yes.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayman Adhir. I am Professor of Practice for Global Consulting and Government Innovation at Thunderbird School of Global Management. It's a comment more than a question. Logistics and infrastructure for logistics is important, but I didn't hear a conversation around creating an integrated ecosystem around entrepreneurship. This is the engine for development, especially if the median of our kids are 19 years old across Africa. So how can we create this integrated ecosystem? Government regulation, access to fund, talent economy, innovation, access to market, and that's what will create the driving force for integration, whether we like it or not. That's what will fuel it. So I think that deserves consideration in how can we really use trade as a driving force for Africa transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just from the African diaspora, but a thought that's been troubling me since yesterday, really. I've wondered, there have been generations of youth who've come and worked in the interstices of trade and economy and so on over generations. Taking the long view, I'm trying to put it in terms of two questions in my mind. The first question is, can economic transformation occur with the current structural protocols within the current policy framework? And the second question is, if you reckon that there's changes needed, what changes are needed what structural changes are needed to power that economic transformation? And the reason that this troubles me is because it seems as though, taking the long view, the substance of the relationship between Africa and whether it's Europe or America or China, the substance of that relationship has remained unchanged for generations. The form has changed. It's changed over time in terms of what's done on the fringes and in the interstices. But if there's structural change needed, what are those structural changes? Thanks.
I'll come back, but this.
Thank you. My name is Noni Ugoma. Just following up that question that the last speaker raised. For me, really, it's about decolonizing trade. How do we go about doing that? Is it possible at this stage of African countries' development for African countries to follow a developmental state model like the Southeast Asian countries? That is what they did. Because right now, Africa, and just like the lady talked about, those structures, those fundamental structures that have been in place since the structural adjustment program, neoliberal policies that more or less were imposed on African countries, continue to be the basis. And so it's almost like your hands and your legs are tied, and you're talking about improving transportation, doing so many things, when those fundamentals are still in place. How do you decolonize trade for genuinely for development to take place in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to ask two questions, and one is based on what happened to East Africa Economic Community. In 2016, they decided to stop imports or reduce imports, and they tried to, especially clothing, to introduce kind of protectionism, form of stopping importing a lot of clothes from outside and producing industries that produce. And what happened was that America frustrated the economic community, and four countries dropped the ambition of having an independent textile industry apart from Rwanda. So I was trying to see what are the threats that this free trade ambitious project is going to face, because I think the long goal is to stop importing things from outside and have trade within Africa. So what are the threats? We clearly heard that the continent is very, divided, and there's all that problem inside. The other thing is, I've traveled along Africa, especially east, west, and to the north, not to the south. And traveling to in Africa as a young man is a nightmare, I have to admit that. And I wanted to understand, what does these agreements bring in terms of human mobility, how African travel within Africa? What kind of policies does it bring for the Africans? Thank you very much.
Let's take maybe just those last 2 or 3. I see 3 hands. Let's take those last 3 because of time. But I think most people have been able to make their input.
Okay, thank you, sir. My name is Suliat Adeleke. So a comment and question I have is, it's easier for African entrepreneurs to raise funding at a better valuation from international investors in the UK and in the US for a variety of reasons. So, what can we do to actually promote African entrepreneurs being able to raise more money from Africa and having more ownership in the entrepreneurial ecosystems from Africa and the innovations there? Because if investment keeps on coming from the UK and the US, isn't that going to lead to a new type of colonialism as well? And another question is, how do we also limit the brain drain from Africa as well? Because other than patriotism or having financial stability, what's the incentive to actually go back to Africa?
Thank you so much. My name is Innocent. My question concerns the Africa Free Trade Continental Area. Africa is often seen as a homogeneous ecosystem, but it's not. And currently, private wealth on the continent, more than 50% of it is found in 4 markets: South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Morocco. So what measures under the Africa Free Trade Continental Area are being put in place to ensure that these bigger markets do not only get the opportunity to dominate the smaller markets, but there's also an opportunity for smaller markets like Rwanda, Burundi, Djibouti, Somalia to equally expand their own fair share of benefits under the Free Trade Continental Area?
And the last one? Yeah.
My name is Aisha Abulaje, and I am building a Made in Africa for Africans personal care and cosmetics business. Maudo spoke about the perception and PR towards African products and services, but you looked at it more from the investor's perspective. That's people looking at Africa. But when we really look at Africans' perception towards African products, there's kind of negative country of origin effects there, where people believe that things made in Africa are of not substantial quality. Who is the onus on to change that perception? You said some companies are running campaigns to change the perspective, but would it be the government's the government or whatever NGO's responsibility to change the perception that people have about products made in Africa?
Well, thank you so very much. We knew that there will be a lot of interest in what you have to say, two panelists on this subject, so we were not at all surprised at the number of questions and comments. So let me turn it over to the panelists, of course, starting with you, Hanan. Take as many of them as you possibly can, and then we go to Maudo. So.
Thank you very much. This is really fantastic. Thanks for all the engagement and energy in simulation. I think there are many, but let me start maybe with, I'll go in a bit of order of what I've taken notes of. So a question came on the issue of risks and what can Africa do. Yes, the issues of debt now is really pressing with the accumulation and the change in the global environment that makes it much harder to obtain financing. It's tighter, but also less affordable because of higher interest rates. So I think there are a number of things that need to be done. Domestically, we need to work on how do we make sure that we maximize the efficiency of our spending, because we have very limited resources. So we need to make sure that every dollar that's spent brings the highest returns, reduce leakages, and work also internally on increasing our domestic resource mobilization so that we are not only relying on external financing. But then at a global level, there are many things that we are advocating for and pushing for at ECA, along with African Ministers of Finance, to really make the global financial system more just and equitable. And I'll be happy to share some of these resources given the time constraint, but I think there are work that need to be done at a national level and work that need to be done at a global level. On the legal framework, yes, there is, of course, the issue of the state capacity, and this is one of the things, for example, ECA is helping in through technical assistance and help in implementation strategies of the African Continental Trade Agreement, including issues of mainstreaming gender and youth in the implementation strategies. And the African Continental Trade Agreement actually does have, articles or mechanisms on dispute resolution, so that is helpful. There was a question about ethical concerns and so on. I think this is an issue that really is being dealt with increasingly by the attention of consumers globally about, caring about where the products came from, how they have been handled or made. So there is increasing attention to this globally, which would shape that area. On the issue of, what is needed to power the economic transformation, well, there are many things that would help. Of course, starting by traveling between African countries without having to go to Europe would help a great deal. So allowing to have more open skies and better connectivity would be a huge help. For those that haven't been in yesterday's presentation by Robert from ECA. Yesterday we were talking about the needs in terms of infrastructure needs and transport to actually enable the implementation of the free trade agreement. So investing in this transport capacity would unleash the benefits of the trade agreement, but also, and I second the gentleman that has spoken earlier, travel within Africa is difficult, and that needs to be changed. We need to have actually easier mobility of labor. We need to be able to travel within the continent easier. Visa regulations and travel restrictions, this need to be eased. If we need to become one market, we need to behave as one. So this is definitely issues of open skies, issues of visa will have to be definitely handled. And also, another thing that I wanted to also mention, because we have been talking about the creativity of youth. I worked on 5 continents. I can, unequivocally say that the amount of creativity that we have, particularly by youth in the continent, is unparalleled. Whether it's in, creative industries, whether be it in music production or in fashion, or even in coming up with solutions, like what we've seen in Kenya and mobile banking. So this is a huge niche for the continent that we need to make sure that it's properly utilized at a global stage. Then there were also questions related to basically the Asian model and what can we learn from it. If I would to choose one thing to learn from the Asian model, is having consistency and having rule-based incentives and less discretion. So basically, when they had incentives for companies, these incentives were maintained based on how the company performed. So they had a certain, key performance indicators. You need to have increased your export by 20% over X amount of time. You need to show that you've been able to, grow your market share. So they had very clear criteria by which these incentives were made. It's not up to a certain ministry or a clerk or whoever. So having the transparency and the rule-based incentive is key. That, I think, would be the takeaway from that Asian experience. Then on the issue of Made in Africa, I think we've seen examples within Africa, and I would like to maybe cite Made in Rwanda experience, where it became something of pride to actually say that you've got something that is made in Rwanda. So it's part of it, I agree with you, has to be like this change in perception and making it a source of pride that you have this that is made, within Africa by Africans, rather than something that you cast doubt on because of the quality. On the quality, we need to make sure that there is like international standards in ways, and I think Africa Continental Trade Agreement would, in a way, address this by having this, certain level of standards that is, would qualify, for example, for trade and export. So building on that, and then on the issue of the national perceptions and changing that would be key. And we've seen a success story, so we can build more within the continent on it. And on the issue of the funding, I agree, I cannot agree more with you. I think we need to have, across intra-African investments and intra-African financing, and more of that, going forward. This is what we want to see. The integration is not just about trade integration. It's about investments, it's about financing, and we have seen actually, just to give credit, private sector have been ahead of governments, by decades. We've seen, companies, and I always said that, by the way, even before the African Trade Agreement, they had they had the vision, they had the will to actually do and make these things happen well before we had the trade agreement. We saw, banks, African banks, expanding in the continent. We've seen insurance companies expanding in the continent. We've seen energy companies actually expanding an infrastructure company. So they kind of like, were years ahead of even governments. So we need to see more of that, and particularly on the funding side, for them to lead the way so that we have, more of the African investments within Africa. So I couldn't agree more. And then on the entrepreneurship, of course, we need like a holistic approach to that, which includes also, as we spoke in the financing, but also issues of regulation. To make it more friendly, to allow access to finance, because the issue that we were talking about earlier, the premium, private sector cannot get funding that is cheaper than what the state gets. That's a given. So basically, whatever funding they're gonna get is, there will be a premium on top of what the government, because the government is supposed to be lower risk. So basically, the fact that Africa already pays 100 basis points to 250 basis points relative to other countries with the same fundamentals means that there is, a higher cost to private sector. So that need to be tackled two ways. One, through the perception, meaning that we need to work on closing the gap between investors that are in versus out. Because if you ask an investor that is a prospective investor, what is the obstacle that you worry about the most? What they're gonna say is political instability, socio-political instability. If you ask an existing investor, what is the largest obstacle? What they are going to say is probably something like, power shortages, infrastructure issues. So the two are like, coming from almost different planets. So what we need to make sure is the links between existing and prospective ones, and clarifying where the risks are, what need to be done, and having that dialogue with the countries to actually fix it will be very important to tackle that perception issue going forward. And then to tackle, meanwhile, while this is being done, we need to work on issues like having cheaper cost of financing through blended financing and de-risking instruments to actually enable the private sector to do what they need to be done. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I know we're running out of time, Maudo, but thank you very much. I think you were comprehensive, Hanan. Maudo, yeah.
Yeah, I'll try not to duplicate anything that's already been said, but I think the question around creating strategic value that allows trade, I think that's a great point, because in the past, we've tried a lot of these policies before around industrial policy, manufacturing. And the mistake I would argue that we made was focusing on import substitution, which created inefficiencies that made a lot of these things unsustainable. So now creating a new way of approaching this, which is focused on exports and embedding it within market forces, I think is a better way of looking at it. So that's, I know that's a bit vague, and but in the interest of time, I think if you'd like to talk about that a bit more, we could. And then the second one is around pain points, structural and around customs and things like that. Unfortunately, I would say that's at its core, okay, it's down to people to change that, right? Because a lot of these things are norms, right? Because what people like Dr. Morsy and others that have worked on this have done is they've created a legal framework that enables this. Now it's up to people to embrace this, take it and evangelize about this and say, this is this great thing that we have now, and get people to buy into it, which stops customs officers from making it difficult for you to trade and things like that, and then creating the incentives that allows that to happen. Right, I hope that's clear. I'm trying to be as concise as possible. And then around development of value chains without impacting environment or human rights. I attended a meeting once where the minister of oil was saying how everything that I say that is correct is from the country that he was representing, and everything that I say that is wrong is me. I'm saying it. And I guess that's what I would say here. I'm not representing, this is my personal choice to say this. But I think expecting, and this is my personal opinion again, expecting Africa to develop to the level of advanced economies without having an environmental impact or infringing in any way on the global standard of human rights is impractical at best and at worst naive. I'll leave it at that. Sorry. And then point number 4 is around economic transformation occur with current policy framework. I think it can occur. However, there's a lot of change that needs to happen on various levels. The challenges that we face a lot of the time are structural. They've been there forever, and you made the point about colonialism. One way I like to think about it is what we're trying to do now is, if you think about trade links as tentacles, right? We're trying to cut the tentacles that we've always had with European countries and so on in terms of trade that have been there. The tentacles have grown, they're easy, And we're trying to cut those and create new tentacles with our neighboring countries. And that's very hard to do. There's going to be a lot of blood, there's going to be a lot of, but it has to happen. I don't mean blood literally, guys. And then there's a question around structural changes are needed to power structural change. Yes. So this question around structural transformation is, I think, all about incentives. And the example that I always use is we need to move from rent-seeking activity to productive activity. And what I mean by that is, let's use the literal word rent, right? For a lot of wealthy Africans, it makes more sense to invest a lot of your money in real estate, collect rent every year, you're comfortable, you drive your big car around, life is good. What we need to do is make it so that wealthy Africans have incentives to invest in productive sectors, i.e. manufacturing, agriculture, and so on, so we don't have to depend on foreign investors, right? So to what extent can we have guys that have made money from anything, from oil, whatever, and they have the money, now instead of them putting all that money into real estate and kicking back and letting the money flow in, maybe they can take a little bit more risk and put that money into, agriculture or manufacturing. That's what will lead to structural transformation, right? All that other rent-seeking stuff won't. So I think that's one way. I'll skip to ones that are different to what I've already said. Yes, improving travel across Africa, absolutely. But there are ongoing efforts to do that, and it includes, many of the organizations that we've already talked about. But there is work being done around that. One of the problems, the key problems there is our airports are lacking in the sort of demand and volume that would allow them to reduce what they charge, airlines and so on to use those airports. So we really need to think about how we can bring those costs down, and that's going to take time and a lot of negotiation, but it's ongoing. And then the last 2 points are around how can we ensure bigger markets don't dominate smaller markets? And this question reminds me of one time when Nyerere was talking about this, and he used boxers as an analogy. And he talked about heavyweight boxers fighting with middleweight boxers, and we know who's going to win. And I think what we need to do is create systems where there's a referee, right? So when the smaller boxer is getting pummeled, the referee can come in and say, enough, it's okay, right? And those referees, I think, are these systems that are being put in place by the AFCFTA around payments, around trade, and so on to create a fair system. And then the last one is the negative perception around African goods. This has been talked about a lot and is very sort of controversial, but I think it's up to all of us, right? It's not just the government. It's not just, it's everybody. It's an all hands on deck effort to change perception. Perception is not tangible. It's not 1 + 1, right? It's something that needs to be done over time. And I'll give you a really quick example. And sorry I keep using Ghana, but I just think that there are a lot of great examples from there. The president, when he came in, the current president, required that all government ministers, including himself, would wear sort of Ghanaian cloth on Fridays, right? And you would think, okay, this is, okay, well, whatever, it's cosmetic. But what actually started happening is those prints that they would wear were associated with wealthy or powerful men in Ghana at some point. So then all these younger people started wearing it because they wanted to look, and then what happens is you create a demand by doing that, right? So these are the small ways in which we can do things incrementally to change perceptions about local goods. Thanks.
Well,
That was so.
yeah, I know, Victor, we're out of time, but I actually wanted to add my own thanks to our two panelists. I think you have been comprehensive in your responses. I also wanted to take this opportunity to flag that we have a book that is coming out on May 25. For those who are in London, we are going to launch it on May 25. The title is How Africa Trades, and actually speaks to a lot of these issues that have been raised here today, including the structural issues, the colonization of trade issues, the issues of standards and quality, and just one snippet to whet your appetite. As they say, numbers don't lie. One of the interesting things is that if you look at how much African governments are spending on their standards authorities, that is to beef up quality of their products, you see a trajectory of an increase in the spending. So that tells you another story that is going on. Also, we are going to debunk this issue about Africans don't have anything to trade with one another. Actually, when you look at the data, it's very surprising. It's not that you just have jollof rice to go with jollof, but there's cement, there's fertilizer, there's food products. There's so many goods that are being traded among Africa. In fact, intra-African trade is more diversified than Africa's trade outside. So May 25, for those who are here, we are launching this book, and your incentive is that you'll get a free copy if you come. So thank you. And before we go, I really want to thank Victory. Victory conceived this panel and organized this panel. So I think.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I enjoyed this session. I believe you all did. And even though we are way past that time, I think it was worth it. So right now we'll be going on the long break, which is going to end by 2:30. And then the next session after that is a panel discussion, which would be in the main building and start at 2:30. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. Because the second one was, I just said, let me just bring this. Oh yeah, that one. The first one. I didn't see it. I wasn't enjoying it. I think, as you can tell, I'm very passionate about government and this, and I think sometimes, yeah, exactly.